Hello dear viewers, support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it, and also make sure you comment your thoughts. After she left, he ate the food and closed his eyes for less than an hour, waking to find the headache gone and Arthur sitting in the chair by the bed, looking down at him. He was happy to see the knight's empty plate on the table behind him. "We have some time, I'd speak to the men and to my aunt," he said, and Arthur nodded. It was hard speaking to Dany. The loss of Ser Bonifer was yet another blow that she didn't deserve to take. He told her that he'd get to spend time with his grandmother now, and that soon they too would see Rella, and he had no doubt that she'd tell them that Bonifer was happy in his death. The words seeming to offer comfort, and he was relieved when Tyrion told him that she'd eaten a little, and that they were ready to do what needed to be done. With the men it was the same. They disliked leaving the tents behind, but the camp was no longer of any use to them. They had welcomed the chance to eat, to drink an ale or two, and to just take a breath, and most had already moved to behind the windwheels. Jay telling them to move even further back and to make ready to form up in an hour or so. Though he didn't speak to his uncles or Jaime, he did offer them smiles and nods of encouragement, and as he passed the men of the fiery hand, he placed his hand on his heart and offered them a small bow, something that the now less than 1,000 men and Melisandre and Moqorro returned. "Sir Richard, 2 volleys, 2 and you ride no matter what. You ride, you understand," he said, standing beside the man. "You're a command, Richard. A command from your king. You ride even if others cannot," he said, and Richard looked at him and stood straighter. "As my king commands," he said, and Jay felt relief at that. Some would not be so lucky, he feared. He made his way back to the dragons. Rhaenys, Elegon, and Rhaegar had eaten and were rested, and as he climbed on Rhaenys's back, he saw the wall begin to flicker and the light beginning to dim. Melisandre, the visions had been clear and she felt no fear, nor did Moqorro and the men of the fiery hand. Ahead of them, the wall of light the prince had used to form a barrier between them, and the dead was beginning to fade. Some dead even moving through it only to be taken down with arrows before they could get too far. Behind her the army her prince had gathered was in formation, and the scorpions had been moved into place. Somewhere further behind was her prince, his aunt, uncle, and the dragons. Fire made flesh and proof of her god's true power. It was always to happen this way. She knew it. Moqorro knew it, and their men knew it. She felt no fear, no doubt, and she was content. Would she have liked longer? Yes, but her time in this world had been long enough, and she'd seen many things, and known more good days than bad. From when she was a slave, to when she became a shadowbinder, and from the time she welcomed her god into her heart. She had done questionable things, both before she'd donned the red robes, and after them. Mistakes that she'd made in misinterpreting his will, until clarity had ensured that she would never do so again. Her greatest achievement in this world had been to serve his chosen prince, to come to these lands and do what her god and the prince asked of her. She'd helped bring the prince and princess together, helped to ensure that princess would be here to play her part just as her god willed her to do. Along with Kinvara and Thoros, she'd seen her god's influence grow in a land that until then had ignored him. A part of her wish she'd see it to the end, see Rhaegar become the true religion it was meant to be. Not above all others, not here at least, but an equal with them. That, however, was not her path, and her fate had been sealed long ago. "Fire!" the shout rang out. Melisandre looked on as the firebolts flew and cut through the dead as if they were nothing. The force they hit them with, forcing the dead in their path back, and the flames then taking hold. Unlike an arrow that took down one dead thing, the firebolts took down many. 5, 10, 20. It was hard to see and tell, but the flames caught and even more fell. It brought a smile to her face, to see it. Fire cleansed and these dead things needed to be cleansed from the world. "Fire!" the shout rang out. The second wave was perhaps even more devastating than the first, the firebolts causing much more damage, and as the flames caught she heard the sound of men mounting horses and then those horses as they rode away. They were alone now, her and her men alone, and the first line of defense, and so she stepped forward, as did Moqorro. And then she closed her eyes. Her chant was one she'd made many times before, and behind her the wind wheels, catapults, and trebuchets soon were alight. Melisandre chanting even louder as she felt them begin to fall onto their sides. They wouldn't provide a full barrier. There would be gaps between them and the ones nearest to them, but that was what she wished for them. The gaps would invite the dead to use them, and once they did, her god's will would be shown. Opening her eyes, she looked at Mokoro to see that the black flame like her was unafraid. He too ready to meet their god. With a small smile, she watched as the spears of the soldiers of the fiery hand began to light up, and as she chanted again, she felt the fire as it formed in her hands, and then the dead were upon them. Watching it as it left her fingers, seeing it engulf the dead that came her way, while beside her Mokoro's flames did likewise, was to see Rhaegar's true power at work. Never did it diminish or disappear. Never did the fire weaken or falter. It was in her hand one moment, and then it took hold of a dead thing that came near her the next. Forward and forward, the dead came. She, Mokoro, and the fiery hand, no true match for them, but that was never to be her role. Delay and damage. Play your part and help the prince, and fight for the living. That was her purpose, and it was one she served well. For Rhaegar, she heard Mokoro call out. And from the corner of her eye, she watched as the fire took him, and he then took down a large group of dead men who'd swarmed over him. For Rhaegar, she heard as men of the fiery hand did likewise. Each man that fell had taken 5, 6, or even more dead men with him, as he did so. This adding to the ones they'd brought down before then, and bringing a smile to her face. 800 men were all that were left of the fiery hand. 800, and yet today, they fought as if there were thousands of them. It had worried her, the idea that the day would come when they would be no more. Her god's truest warriors were like her to meet their end in this place, and it had worried her greatly. What did that mean for the order? For the great temple in Volantis? What did that mean for the future? Again her god had answered and calmed her fears and removed her worries. More were to come, their strength even greater than those who came before them. The removal of the Great Other had always been their purpose, and their sacrifice would not go unrewarded. Just as hers, Mokoro's, and Thoros's would not. She felt it when the time drew close. The last of the fiery hand had already fallen, and she stood alone as dead men moved past her and reached the burning barriers she'd helped create. That they passed her and didn't seek to bring about her end should have worried her, and yet it did not. Melisandre knew what it was they wished for, and what the Night King sought to do, and so she turned to look at Rhaegar's majesty, and the smile she wore when she saw it was the truest she'd ever worn. It was like an inferno, the flames shooting out from the burning windwheels, and other contraptions that the prince's army had brought to this place. To the sides, to the back, and in front. As soon as the dead reached it and could not retreat, her god's flames let loose as if from a dragon's mouth. Were that the last sight she'd see in this world then, she'd be happy, but as she felt the icy cold she knew it would not be. It wasn't the Night King himself, though it was one of his generals, and as she turned to face him, she felt the cold of the icy blade as it pierced her heart. Had this been a different time, it would have tested her faith. Was she unaware of her prince? Then it would have broken her as she felt the cold replace the warmth that she felt inside. If her belief wasn't as strong as it was, then her end would have been an ignoble one. Instead, she moved and let the fire flow from her one last time, burning some but allowing her to get close to the White Walker, and then pulling the small dragonglass dagger from her dress, she ended him. Melanie, Lot 7. The prince that was promised will bring the dawn. Fire cleanses. A mission from our god, Melisandre. You've been chosen. To lose faith is a terrible thing. To have it restored is more than a drunk priest such as I could ever have asked for. It's time to come home, my child, to be welcomed into my embrace, and to receive my favor. The voices sounded in her head, and some she recognized. Kinvara, Mokoro, Thoros, and the last was one she'd wished to hear all her life. Her god finally speaking to her, not in flames and visions but in words. She fell to the ground and felt the dead move to her, and she knew that her end was to be a painful one. It scared her. She'd not lie, it scared her greatly. Not the death, but the dying, and the pain she'd feel as she did so. Do you think I would allow that to be your end? The voice boomed, and she felt her fear just fade away, and as she looked at the sky she saw the white dragon, as she flew, and then she felt the flames as her prince sent her to her god. Cregan Stark. The things he'd seen marching with Jay and the army were things he'd never have expected, and not just the dead that came after them. What his cousin could do was and should be impossible, and yet it was anything but. As he then sat with his good father and good brother, and eaten while a wall of light held the dead at bay, he found that he was beginning to almost come to terms with the powers that Jay possessed. Almost. What he'd not even begun to come to terms with was that Jay was not alone in possessing such powers. He, like the lords of the north, had simply accepted that his cousin was gifted by the old gods, and it made it easy enough for them to then not look upon him with fear or doubt. The Red Priests, though, got their gifts from a god they knew little about, other than that he was the god of flame and shadow. So seeing them in action, watching as they lit fires with barely a snap of their fingers or how their weapons would alight simply by their will, that was harder to understand. Though compared to what he'd just seen, it was very much not. He'd stood in line, his good father a few men down from him, his good brother by his side, and they had watched as what looked to be balls of fire had flown out from the Red Priest and Priestess's hands. They'd watched as the wind wheels, catapults, and trebuchets had lit up with no one near and no flame in sight, and then had collapsed onto their sides. With that all they'd seen, then it would have been enough. But he'd looked on as men became fire itself, as dead men burned and those who neared the fallen wind wheels had found flames reaching out to take hold. "Here they come!" a voice called out, and he welcomed it. His mind not yet ready to deal with all he'd seen. "Shield wall," the call went out, and in front of him the shields went up, and the spears were moved forward. Cregan felt the impact as the dead crashed against their shields. He knew was he able to look over them and off into the distance. Then he'd see the dragons, let loose their own flames, yet he could only see what was in front of him. The gap opened, and he thrust forward the dagger and felt the white fall as the gap closed up again. "Back," the voice called out, and as one they moved a step, and then two backward. Again the gap opened, and again he thrust forward, the dagger finding its target, and another white falling for true. It was never ending. The dead just kept coming, and no matter how many times the gap opened up, and he pushed forward, it seemed to make no difference. He felt it then, he knew when it was to happen, and that he or they couldn't stop it. They were to be breached, and as he closed his eyes he knew it was Dusk who'd told him so. Make ready, he shouted as loudly as he could. "Breach, breach," he added as he moved from the men in front of him and reached for the axe he bore. As much as he hated that they had forced their way through, he welcomed it a little also. Thrusting through a gap was not where his talents lay, and any man could do so. He was a swordsman, even if for now he didn't wield a sword. Movement was key to him. It defined him, and as the dead came at him, Cregan began to move. His first strike caught a white across the face, the dead thing falling to the ground as Cregan already began to swing his second. He moved through them as if he was at a ball or feast, and it was a dance he was doing, easily dodging a strike aimed at him, and then taking down the white who had dared to do such a thing. Sidestepping another as his axe caught it across the back. When he heard the howl it stopped him in his tracks, and his eyes soon found the reason for it. His good father and good brother were both facing off against a whiter walker some distance away, and they were losing. "Alice," he shouted out, though he may have well whispered it. The sound not heard among the sounds of battle around him. Cregan ran faster than he ever had, and moved past men who were fighting the dead, his axe reaching out and helping where he could, and yet never once did he stop and slow down. He saw the blow before it landed, and heard the pained scream from his good brother as his good father fell. His own joining him as he thought about his wife and about the man himself. Rickard Karstark had welcomed him into his family, and they'd become close on from that moment onward. "Harrion, watch out," he shouted, and was relieved to see his good brother had heard his words, and managed to dodge the strike. The next strike was one he himself faced, the White Walker's attention on him, and as he moved against him, Cregan quickly realized he was outmatched. It felt as if he was being toyed with, and even when Harrion moved to help him, he wasn't certain that together they could take him down. The black shape that moved behind it and the howl that Dusk made as it ran towards the White Walker gave him the opening he needed to win the fight. It distracted it, for a fraction of a second it distracted the White Walker as he looked to Dusk with what looked like concern. Cregan swung his axe and felt the dragon glass as it slashed down the White Walker's chest. Around them, dead men fell in their hundreds as the White Walker exploded, and ice covered the ground where he stood. Targaryen looked to him relievedly and then to the body of his father as he lay on the ground. Anything but. He moved with his good brother, and together they heard Rickard speak his last words. The soft touch he gave to Harrion's cheek seeming out of place for such a large man. "For the king and for the north, you burn me, boy, and then you end these fucks." "For the king and for the north," Rickard said as Harrion sobbed over his father's body and Cregan looked for a torch. They had little time to burn him, and even less to mourn him, as while they'd bought some breathing room, killing the White Walker, the dead wouldn't rest for long. "For the king and for the north," he said, helping Harrion away from the burning remains of Rickard Karstark. "For the king and for the north." Harry said, and they moved to gather as many men as they could and ready themselves for the dead that came their way. Benjen, they were relentless. They just kept coming no matter how many you took down. Had they not rested up after Jay had put up the wall of light, then the day would already be lost. Even with that rest, he could feel the tiredness within himself, and he knew that, as much as the enemy they faced, would cost them dearly today. He fought with Valments, Spearwives, and Dattons, Hornfoots, and even Crows, something that both the Free Folk and his former brothers never would have imagined they'd ever do. Curse the old gods for forcing me to fight with a fucking crow. Boss said annoyedly, "You're sleeping with one," he replied, smirking at her. "You stopped being a crow the day you stole me, Benjen Stark," she said, as she kissed him. Even in the situation, he was in the thought of her brought a smile to his face. Then again, she'd done that since he'd known her. She caught the look and glared at him. That she did so while she took down a white was perhaps another reason why he loved her so much. He'd never sought a bride, and maybe that was because he found ladies to be strange, confusing, and confounding. Or maybe it was because he was never to be with a lady, as he had never found Val to be any of those things. "Will you fucking stop smiling and fight for fuck's sake?" Val said, and Benjen knew he'd better do as she bid. Not that he hadn't been fighting, just he was daydreaming as he did so, and that along with the tiredness would get him killed. He swung the sword and another white fell, then another and then another. Looking to Val and Mance, he knew they were fighting badly. Wrongly, they needed to do better, to be better. "With me," he shouted as he began to move. Val looking at him confusedly before she and others began to follow. They were fighting as individuals. They needed to be smarter, and so after they'd put some distance between the dead and themselves, he looked to those with him. Ed and some of the Black brothers, Mance, Val, and some of the men and women from Queen's Crown. "We form lines, some in front, some behind. We rotate when those fighting are tired, we move them, and replace them with those who are not," he said loudly. "Like with the shield wall?" Ed asked, and Benjen nodded. "Aye, otherwise our strength will give out," he said to nods from the Black brothers. "More than the Free Folk. You heard him lines," Val shouted, and he caught the small smile she gave him. Around them, others began to do the same once they saw the dead being held back by those that fought with him. There were gaps, and the dead tried to get through them, and some managed it. But they were ridden down by men on horses. The Knights of the Vale couldn't charge against the amount of dead that attacked them, but they were better on the back of a horse than on foot, and so they rode against the smaller groups as if they were retreating soldiers. The effect was just as devastating against the dead. He felt his strength come back to him as he rested, the rotation of the lines allowing them to be so much more effective, and fewer of them fell than perhaps would have. In the distance they could all see the dragons do their work, and he was relieved to see Rannick still flying so well. Benjen relaxing upon knowing that his nephew was as safe as he could be. The howl caught him by surprise. It was loud and it was pained, and he saw Val look to him, as did Mance. I must, he said, though he knew not where, or who the wolf was calling him to aid. "I've got this, Benjen. Go, go," Mance said, and he began to run, Val running fast alongside him as they moved towards the sound of the howling wolf. It felt as if fate, or the old gods, wished him there, the dead leaving them unmolested, and when he reached the wolf he found his nephew turning to him and looking at him worriedly. "Benjen, thank the gods you're safe," Robb said, embracing him, and Benjen looked from him to the wolf and then back to his nephew. "The pack, uncle," Greywind called, "because the pack is in danger," Robb said, and Benjen offered him the only comforts he could, a hand on his shoulder and words. "Your brother is on Rannick's back. Look," he said, pointing off in the distance, and he felt Robb take a deep, relieved breath. "Cregan?" he asked, and Benjen shook his head. "I saw him as we ran. He's unharmed," Val said, and then Greywind howled again. "Father," Robb said, now even more worriedly, and when the wolf moved so did they. Dwarves. Arthur was like 10 men, his sword cutting down through the dead as if they were beneath him, which they very much were. How many he alone had ended was impossible to count. Jers knew his own tally, lagged far behind, though he reckoned other than the kings or the prince and princess on their dragons. There was not a man or woman who fought today who'd even come close. He himself had been no slouch either, and yet the dead still came. To the left Arthur fought alongside Jaime and Oberyn, the three of them perhaps the most deadly warriors on the ground this day. He fought close to Ned Stark. He was not able to guard his king, and so he'd guard his kin. The Lord of Winterfell swung his greatsword almost as well as Arthur did. No, that was a lie, but the effect of him swinging it was as true. Ice, just like Dawn and his king's own dark sister, was a blade of legend, and seeing it in action, it was clear why. Who felt it first he knew not, but he moved closer to Lord Stark when he did so. The chill in the air was different than the cold of the north. This one was unnatural, where the other was very much not. Looking behind him, he saw them as they moved towards Oberyn. Jaime and Arthur, and a part of him wished to run to them, to offer his sword and help. Yet the two that moved to Ned Stark soon changed his mind. He knew it then. This was no coincidence. No quirk of fate that had found the White Walkers and three men his king saw as family meeting each other on the battlefield. This was a plan, and as he cut through dead men, he swore he'd not allow it to succeed. Lord Stark, you must retreat, he shouted as the White Walkers moved closer. I'll not leave my men, and those things shall not pass. Ned Stark said, and Jorah sighed, though he knew that the time for retreat was long since past. With a last look at the others, he saw Jaime and Arthur easily matching blades with the creatures of ice they faced, and though he couldn't see Oberyn, he knew that he too would be doing likewise. Jorah moved closer to Ned Stark. The White Walkers easily cut down those who dared stand in their way, and he soon found himself face to face with one, while the other moved to Ned Stark, who stood ready to face him. As his blade crashed against the icy one, he saw the look of surprise on the White Walker's face, or what he assumed was surprise. The two blades coming together once again, and he thanked his king for the gift he'd given him. Behind him, Ned Stark seemed to be matching the White Walker blow for blow, and he thanked the gods for that. When the blow came, it caught him so by surprise that for some time he didn't even realize it was a fatal one. Not until he saw the White Walker move away from him and fell to the ground did he realize he was done for. Lord Stark, run, run, he shouted, as the single White Walker that Ned Stark had faced now became two. While not truly a match for either, Ned had held his own against one, and as Jorah felt his life begin to ebb away, he prayed that he'd be able to do so against two until help arrived. He heard the howling of the wolves, and looked into the distance to see Rhaenys fly his way, and he smiled at the thoughts of seeing his king come to his uncle's rescue. He had done enough. He'd bought Ned Stark time, he'd served his king well, and as his eyes began to close, he felt he could rest. "Alarce I come, my friend," he said before he screamed out. No, as he saw the two blades enter Ned Stark's body, one from the front and one from behind. And while he may have not known his own wound was fatal for some time, he knew that Ned's were "Forgive me, my king," he said as the darkness overtook him. Losses. The Night King. 70,000 whites. 3 White Walkers. The armies of those who fight to bring the dawn. 800 men of the Fiery Hand. 5,000 men, mixed from each of the realms. Mokoro. Melisandre, Lord Rickard Karstark, Sir Bonifer Hasty, Sir Jorah Whitwolf, Ned Stark. Numbers remaining. The Night King, 250,000 to 300,000. White Walkers 25 to 50. The armies of those who fight to bring the dawn, 20,000 to 250,000. Riverlands 302 AC. Jaime Lannister. The rest had been needed. Jaime not even thinking about how Jay had done what he'd done, and just thankful for it. As he was to see him rest, even if it was just for an hour or so, after he'd done it. He'd eaten, drank, and while he'd not closed his eyes, he had taken the chance to rest himself too, as he had taken the opportunity to speak to his brother and uncle. Tyrion was well, tired and hungry, as were so many of them, but he was well. Kevin, on the other hand, was anything but. It took him some time to realize what it was that was truly bothering his uncle, and he felt a fool when he did so. Unlike the rest of them, Kevin and the men he brought with them hadn't truly seen the dead and certainly hadn't faced them. He did his best to comfort him, to offer him up whatever words he could, and to give him advice on how to face them when next they came. While he didn't relieve all his uncle's concerns, he felt he was in a far better place when he left him than he had been prior to him speaking with him. He talked to the men, offered them his thanks, and told them all how very proud he was to fight by their sides. His words were perhaps not as meaningful to some as JC's were, but they still resonated. Then he took up his position when Jay said it was time, and with black fire in hand, he waited. He'd thought he'd seen it all today, the wildfire lighting up the sky with a vivid green light, and Jay creating a wall of light by simply willing it into existence. As he and the others looked on, they saw the scorpions fire the first of the firebolts, and as they then cut through the dead as if they were nothing. The second volley was even more impressive, and he heard some cheers ring out from the men, and he then looked on relievedly as those who had fired them soon came riding towards them, their lines opening to allow them to ride through and to then form up alongside them. Then he, like everyone else, there watched as Melisandre, Mokoro, and the Fiery Hand showed off the power that faith in their god had given them. The wind wheels, catapults, and trebuchets all catching fire so quickly and suddenly that it could only be a magical thing that caused it. He and others heard the chanting and watched as a barrier of fire was made, and then looked on in amazement as when the dead moved between the gaps between each obstacle they now faced, the flames reaching out and taking them as they did so. Jaime didn't see Melisandre and the others fall, but he had no doubt they had, as soon enough it was a full-on attack they were faced with. "For the king and to bring the dawn," he shouted as he moved forward and held Blackfire high. "For the king and to bring the dawn." Arthur shouted, "For the king and to bring the dawn." Oberyn did likewise, and Jaime heard the shouts rise as they spread down through the lines. He stepped back in line, roared out for those around him to ready their shields and spears and form a shield wall, and then heard the sound of the dead as they crashed against the shields. As the gaps opened up, he thrust his sword into them. The dead he hit, falling, as soon as the Valyrian steel pierced their flesh. Arthur was some distance away, not too far, and still in his view as was Oberyn, but now that the fight was truly upon them, and so he barely paid them any mind. Over and over he thrust Blackfire, and occasionally when a white managed to break through the shield wall, it was a slash of the sword that ended its journey. When it happened, he knew not. Why it happened, he understood very quickly, as he felt the air chill even more, and saw the line began to break. It had been inevitable. Try as they might, they'd not be able to hold the line forever, and though he wished it had held for longer, they'd planned for this too. He moved back and readied his sword, and then in his loudest voice he began to shout, "Close quarters. Close quarters," he shouted out, and heard others call out once he had. In time, if they were able to, they'd reform the lines. For now, the fight was one that any man who had fought in a battle had faced more than once. It was one-on-one, side by side, enemies in their ranks, and all men were now to fight with all they had. That it was against dead things and not living men made no difference, as the only thing you left to fight with was your life. Nothing else truly mattered, other than that, and he knew that these men knew that too. The dead came at him, Jaime moving from their poor attempts to take him down with ease. Blackfire was not being swung with elegance, because it didn't need to be. Slashes replacing thrusts as he sidestepped away from whites, and it was only the sheer number of them that provided any real danger to him. Down the line he could see good men fall and good men fight on, and he found he couldn't judge how many of which side there was and what way the battle was turning. In the sky, in the distance, he could see flames being let loose and all three dragons being brought to bear. When the dead around him began to feel lesser, Jaime almost believed that they'd taken the advantage almost. It moved gracefully and cut down his men as easily as he had cut down the dead. The White Walker was almost nonchalant, as it killed any who faced it. For a man who had seen, fought, and was one of the very best swordsmen that ever lived, it was an impressive sight. Jaime, though, was not just a swordsman. He was a leader, hand of the king, and so he began to call out and told his men to move away from it, and to leave it to him. Happy when they did as they were bid, though not at the look on the White Walker's face as he swore he saw it smirk at him. With a quick glance behind him, he saw more of them move. One towards Arthur, another towards Oberyn, and he knew it then, and it angered him greatly. "You think you'll break my king's spirit?" he shouted furiously, as he moved to the White Walker. "You don't know my king, and it'll be your own who breaks here today," he said, as Blackfire clashed against a sword of ice. For all the lack of skill he'd shown so far today, he now fought with everything he had in him. Every lesson, every spar, from when he was a boy, to now had led him to this point, and as the two swords clashed, it was perhaps one of the evenest matchups he'd ever faced. G had gotten closer to him, and perhaps even surpassed him by now. Arthur was still the very best he'd ever known, the very best there had ever been. He'd wager the White Walker was on a par with the Bold, with himself and perhaps with Arthur too. Each move he made was countered. Feints were not fallen for, and he found himself on the defensive more often than not. There were openings there though, and if he could just manage to be ready for one when it came, then he'd win this fight. He heard the cheers as a White Walker fell, and were he to guess he'd say it was Dawn that had ended its fight. As he swung Blackfire and moved away from a strike aimed at his head, he smiled and then jumped into the air. The spin was a thing of beauty, Jaime turning in a complete circle as he flashed Blackfire wide before thrusting forward only for the blade to be parried. His dragonglass dagger, however, was not, and he felt it as it struck home, and had to shield his eyes from the explosion of ice that now covered him. Around him, dead men fell. Hundreds of them, maybe even thousands of them, and he understood that while some near Arthur may have seen him take down the White Walker, more would have seen the dead as they fell, and had cheered for that. He heard the cheers ring out again, as those nearest him had seen what he had done, and those a little further away found some breathing room, with no dead around them. It was not to last long, and as he looked to see Arthur face off against another White Walker, he could see no sign of Oberyn, and tried not to think the worst. Truth be told, he had no time to think that way, as the dead soon came charging towards them. The only thing that was moving faster than them was Rhaenys, and she let loose her flames on dead men to even louder cheers. "The king," he shouted, as Jay flew over his head, their eyes meeting, and he gave him what he hoped was a reassuring nod to let him know he was unhurt. "For the king and to bring the dawn," he called out loudly, as Jay and Rhaenys flew out of his view. "For the king and to bring the dawn," those nearest to him said, and then he and they were facing off against dead men once more. Riverlands 302 AC. Dany. She rested, ate, checked that Grey Worm, and her men were safe and well. Or as safe and well that anyone could be on the edge of a battle. Tyrion spoke to her as did Jay and tried to offer her comfort for Bonifer's loss. But Dany was feeling numb, and their words, though welcomed, just didn't hit home. Not yet at least. Perhaps later, once she had a chance to breathe for true. Then they'd mean so much more to her, and would be more appreciated. Now all she wished for was to be back on Elegon's back, and to bathe the dead and the Night King himself in flames. How long she sat and rested for she couldn't tell. Jay had slept some, the exertion of the magic he'd used to form the wall of light having necessitated it. While she perhaps could have done with some sleep herself, she feared what her dreams may bring her, and so she stayed awake. Eventually it was time, and she, Tyrion, and Jay made their way to the dragons, and she was glad they spoke no words, and instead they just readied to go back into the fray. With a nod to her and to Tyrion, Jay and Rhaenys took to the sky, and the other two dragons quickly followed. As they flew over the lines of their men, she heard the cheers, and these did at least bring a smile to her face. Dragons and their riders should be cheered, they should be feted, and given the army that they faced and the threat they were here to deal with, they were very much needed. Marwyn and Aemon had both said to her that there were those Maesters Mainsley who had doubted the reason for dragons existing. She had, when she spoke to the Maesters in the Citadel, brought up the reasoning for her family coming here, for the conquest, and for their right to rule. Today had shown that reason even more clearly than any words she'd spoken. Robert Baratheon wasn't equipped to face this threat. Jon Arryn wasn't, and Tywin Lannister would not have been. Other houses may play their part, and she was most pleased they'd come to Jai's side, and fought side by side with them, in what was the most important battle any of them would ever fight in. It was dragons, though, her house and her kin that would win the day, and without her children, without Jai's, they were lost. "Dracarys," she said as she flew over the dead, and as Elegon let out her flames. Dany smiled once more. Just like before they'd gone to rest, they'd split up, and this time it was she on the left, and Tyrion on the far right, with Jay taking up the middle again. Though it looked to all intents and purposes as if they'd not even made a dent in the Night King's army, she could feel the truth of things, and it was very much different. There was panic, annoyance, anger, and she heard him order them to take them down and to do so now. Dany was not sure who they were, but she found herself most happy to hear the worry in the Night King's voice. Feeling her shoulder tingle, she wondered if when he was dead would she feel it still. It was as she was thinking this that the other voice called out to her, softer, quieter, a whisper almost. "Come, come, help me," the voice said, and Dany looked to the dead below, to the two dragons in the distance, and to their men fighting against the dead further back, and then she and Elegon moved away and went in search of that voice. They didn't just fly over the dead in search of it. Dany had Elegon lay down her flames at any large group they flew over until there was none beneath them, and then and only then did she begin to worry that she was being led into a trap. She closed her eyes and sought him out, listened for his voice, and found it to be there. Still worried, still angered, and there was something else there too. It was more than an annoyance. More than anger, it was a fury she'd never felt before. For some reason this comforted her, and when she heard the voice again, she felt that it may be the reason for that fury. "Come, hurry, come," the voice pleaded, and Dany bid Elegon fly faster. She saw the dead running beneath her, a large group of them, and as she flew towards them, she saw they were chasing something. No, someone. There was someone up ahead of them, and the dead were gaining on them. "Dracarys," she said almost impatiently. Her rush and hurry seemed odd to her, and she knew not why she had felt the need for either Dracarys. She said, not more than a blink of an eye. Later, Elegon's flames barely having been loosed, and yet her dragon then did as she bid once again. The dead beneath them burned, and she saw the lone White Walker move past the flames. Bidding Elegon fly faster still, her dragon responded to the desperation in her voice. When she reached who it was that the dead had been chasing, she felt a fool. It was a trap. She'd flown into a trap, and the White Walker, though it wouldn't burn in her dragon's flames, would feel them anyway. "Demita," a voice called out, and it stayed, the order at her lips. "Demi, help me," the voice said, and she looked and saw it. Then, this wasn't any White Walker, this was Shira. Gods, what had they done to her? What had he done to her? She told Elegon to land, and her dragon did so, a few feet away from where her aunt, or what was now her aunt, was standing. Demi climbed down of her dragon's back and drew her daggers before moving closer to Shira. Her aunt was ice made of ice, and yet there was more of her true self there than she had expected. Seeing her mismatched eyes gave her some hope that she was still in there, that it wasn't a mistake she was making, and she wasn't being lured into a trap by a woman she named as kin. "Shira?" she asked softly. "Take me from here. Please, Dany. Take me from here." Shira answered. There were no words spoken aloud, and yet Dany heard them as if they were. "Aye. Dany, I'm almost free. Almost. Please. I beg of you." Shira begged, her voice in her head once more, and Dany looked at her and nodded. She helped her to climb up onto Elegon's back, and felt the relief coming off her aunt in waves. Not even the cold of her skin, as it brushed against her own, made her doubt that she was doing the right thing. The ice spear came when they were in the air, and Elegon easily dodged it, Dany swearing that she heard an angered cry from a voice she'd grown now to know was his. Yet as they flew, it was a different voice in her head that she listened to. "Thank you, I feared you'd not come," Sheriar said softly, her words coming from her mouth this time, and Dany almost lost her grip in Elegon's reins. Are you? Can you?" she said, stumbling over her words, as she couldn't manage to form a coherent question. "The losses weakened him enough for me to break free from his control. I am as you see me, and until he falls, I'll remain that way. Though for now, he cannot change me further. Rhaegar, we should bring—" "No," Shera said loudly. "I cannot risk it. Dany, I'll see Rhaegar again. For now, he's better where he is, safe and away from here, and far from me." Her aunt's sadness at being parted from the green dragon clear to hear in her voice, and it relaxed Dany enough to be sure that it was truly her aunt she flew with. "Emandi," said softly, "is with his brother and sisters, with his mother and nieces and nephews. He will be missed, and in the days to come, mourned, but for now, there is much we must do."
Jay, you need to take me to Jay.
Dany, Shera said, and despite herself, Dany felt apprehensive about that. "You can place guards around me, keep me some distance from him. Do whatever you need to ensure his safety, but I must speak, and he must hear." "Hear what?" "What he plans to do, where he's going." Shera said, her voice sounding worried. "Where?" Dany asked. "The Isle of Faces. He means to kill the children and the three-eyed raven. Adder Elegon, Adder Asid Fast, Elegon. Fast as the wind," she said, and her dragon needed no second invitation to do as she ordered. Riverlands 302 AC, Stannis. It was no great comfort that brothers who'd not believed him when he told them of the threat beyond the wall, now looked at him in a very different light. If anything, Stannis would have much preferred them to be right, and he to the one that was wrong. Had it meant there was not an army of dead men coming their way, then he'd have gladly lived the rest of his life being mocked and named a liar. That was far better than the alternative ever could be. He was not a liar, though, not a fool, and at the wall when they'd faced them, he'd watched as brothers who'd named him such had fallen to the Night King's army. As they'd marched through the north, he'd expected many more would fall. Hijara, Semon Santagar, Bowen Marsh, Edison Tollett, and others had spoken of it often. Only Cotter Pike and Denys Mallister had said that it would not be the way. Both men saying that the king had a different plan in mind, and Stannis was glad they were proved more right than he. It was Gior who told him the truth of that plan. Hit and run, make the dead chase, and then fight them only when you were ready to. Stannis felt it a good one, and it made him think back to the War of the One True King, to how they'd all lost out to a boy who should have been green and who had beaten them before it had even truly begun. This war was different, he knew, but he was relieved. They had that boy leading him, and that they had dragons to burn the dead. His relief, though, was soon gone once the battle started for true. Seeing his brothers fall and watching how, despite all they did, the dead kept coming was enough to take away his relief, if not his faith. It was why he fought as fiercely as he did, and why he led not by words but by example, as he did so. "Tollett!" he shouted as he pushed Ed out of the way. Stannis catching the white across the head with his dragonglass morningstar. "Fuck," Ed said as he rose back to his feet, and then swung his axe at another white that moved his way. "Pay attention, dumb fucks, they may be, but they'll still end you." "Ed," Simon said with a chuckle, and Stannis admired how the man could do so, given what they faced. He heard a scream and saw another brother in black fall. Daenerys Mallister and Bowen Marsh having lost their own fights not too long ago, and he felt this loss as much as he had theirs. Stannis may have been born a lord, but he was a black brother now, and these were truer brothers than the ones the gods had seen fit to give him. "The Lord Commander," he heard a shout call out, and despite the dead moving towards them, he, Ed, and Simon moved to where he believed Gior was. What he saw when he got there was something he'd never imagined possible. Around Gior there were maybe 20 or 30 black brothers, fighting and strewn along the ground, was almost twice that number. The reason for such carnage was now cutting his way through his brothers, as if they were green boys, and not former soldiers of the Golden Company. "Protect the Lord Commander," he shouted as he and those with him joined the fight. The dead came at them before they could reach Gior and the others, Stannis and those with them fighting furiously to move past them. His morning star was a blur, as was Ed's axe and Simon's mace. Whites were falling to the ground, only to be replaced by more and more of them. Ahead of him, he could see the White Walker cut down and threw men as if they were not there. Stannis called out for an archer to take the fucker down, and his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. There were no archers around, and it would be up to them to take the White Walker down. If they could ever manage to get to it, that was. By the time they'd fought through the dead, Gior was fighting for his life. Around him lay the men that had just been killed by the White Walker. And reaching into his belt, Stannis took the knife and hoped his aim proved good and true. It was not. Or to be more accurate, his aim was good, but the White Walker had anticipated it. And stepping back into the side, he blocked the knife, and Stannis watched it fall helplessly to the ground. The White Walker then went to raise its hands, only for Gior to almost catch it with a blow from his mace. Stannis running towards them both, and he was but a few feet away when the strike came that cost Gior Mormont his life. "No," he shouted out, and then he was there. The gasping breaths that Gior made, as he tried to take in air, sounding loud in what had become to Stannis a still and quiet night. The swing of the morning star was as powerful a swing as he had in him, as was the one that followed, and the one that followed after that. Stannis, forcing the White Walker back and allowing his anger and rage to fuel him for the fight ahead, he dodged the blows aimed at him or deflected them with the head of his morning star. It was clear the White Walker sought to hit its shaft and cost him his weapon, but Stannis wouldn't allow him the chance to do so. "Ours is the fury," he shouted loudly, and then he repeated it, as he forced the White Walker to take a step, and then another step backwards. "Ours is the fury." Moving out of the way of a thrust from the icy blade, he swung as hard as he could, and heard the sound of the ice as it exploded. To his left, Ed and Simon fought side by side with Waldings. Free folk, and were it another day, and another place. Then even Stannis may have smiled at that. With the White Walker's death, the dead fell. Not all, but most of those nearest to him, and those that Ed and the others fought against. Stannis moved away from the pile of ice, and to the man laying on the ground. The old bear was holding his wound, and his eyes were closing. "Tuer," he said, kneeling down. Ed and Simon moving to him, as did the last of their men. "I fought bravely, Stannis. I go to my gods happy with that, even though I wished it was not today." Chero said, "Aye, Lord Commander, no man fought more bravely," he said, and he hoped his words showed their truth. "I leave it to you, Stannis. It's in good hands. For the watch." Jero said as he closed his eyes and breathed no more. For the watch, he said, as he rose to his feet.
And now his watch has ended,
Ed said, his voice for once feeling apt for the situation, the dolorous tone feeling right at place here today. Your orders, Lord Commander. Simon asked, and Stannis looked at him incredulously. They were few, less than 20 near him, and though he hoped there were more remaining, he feared the watch had ended here, this day. Even had it not, it soon would given that this was all there was left, and that the dead kept coming. We are the swords in the darkness, the watchers on the wall, the shields that guard the realms of men. Those things are not men, and we are what stands in their way. For the watch, he said, his words growing louder. For the watch, Ed Simon and the others said, and as one they turned ready to face the next wave that came their way. They would not have long to wait. Riverlands 302 AC. Oberyn. They came out of nowhere, or that's how it seemed. Amongst the dead and covered by them, if he was to wager a guess. Certainly not out in the open, or he and their archers would have seen them. Then once they breached the line they split off, the dead who were with them moving to any man with a bow and the White Walkers moving to their own targets. Jaime, Arthur and him, and was he to hazard a guess then, he'd say Garlem, Loras, Ned and Benjen Stark, along with Robb and Cragen too, had been targeted. The Night King was going after those his nephew loved and cared about, and it angered him greatly. It had been that anger that had taken down the White Walker, that and his spear proving more true than the icy blade it wielded. Oberyn hearing the cheers as a large group of the dead fell as it did. His victory was short-lived, and this time it wasn't one that came at him, but two, both of them working as a team, and quickly forcing him on the back foot. When his men rushed to his aid, the White Walkers ended them as if they were nothing. So many falling that Oberyn had needed to order them to back away. Just as he was doing now, his spear blocking the blow that would have ended him while his jump dodged the one from the other icy blade. Back and back he was forced, and the sheer effort of just doing enough to stay alive was tiring him out. The luck he'd had for most of his life was perhaps playing a part too, both good and bad. Throwing the dagger underhanded, he watched the White Walker block it contemptuously. Little knowing that it was but a feint, and Oberyn moved more quickly than he had up to that point. He thrust his spear, and felt the ice crack, and then explode. A high-pitched scream ringing out that was music to his ears. He thought it was the one who'd fallen, who'd screamed at first, only to then realize it was the other one. Oberyn smirking at it as he had taken away something it cared about, just as it had sought to do the same to Jay. Its anger was clear in how furiously it then attacked him, forcing him further and further back, and here bad luck replaced good. The stone took his footing and he felt the spear fall from his hands. A flash in his mind of another fight, a long time ago now. This time there was no ghost nearby, there was no Jay to ward into the mountain to give him the chance to save himself. Knowing what was to come, he thought of his girls and how proud he was of each of them, how much he loved them all, his grandniece who would one day be queen, Elia, she'd been named for the sister he loved so much, Elianne, and the babe she carried, a babe he'd now not get to see, or to hold, and spoil. Gideon all he'd given him, justice and a reason to believe, once more. Lastly he thought of her face, his love, his wife, his life. Illyria, he said softly, as the blade moved to end him. It never stuck home. The White Walker was there, and then it was not. So quickly did it disappear, that Oberyn wasn't sure what had happened, or even that he may not have just dreamed the entire thing. Only the sight of his spear on the ground a few feet away allowed him to know it was real. Rising to his feet, he moved to the spear and picked it up, and then looked around to see if he could make sense of what had just happened. As he did so, he saw her. Rhaenys was flying high in the air, and he could see something in her talons, something that she dropped to the ground before landing beside it. Despite the fight around him, it was to his niece that he rushed, and he arrived just in time to see Jay climb down off her back. Lightbringer was in his hand as he moved towards the thing on the ground. Oberyn, looking to see it, was the White Walker that he had fought. The fight it would now have was to be a much quicker one, and he looked on as Jay deflected the blow and then thrust forward. Never did he think that ice exploding could be such a beautiful sight, and maybe the light from Jay's sword played a part in that. Or perhaps it was that he'd come so close to dying at this thing's hands, only to be saved by his niece and nephew. Jay, he said, moving to him, and he saw the worried look on his nephew's face. I'm well, he added quickly.
How?
He asked. But Bird, I saw you were in trouble. Ray and I came as quickly as we could, Jay said, sadness clear in his voice as he spoke. Who? He asked, and he saw his nephew's head drop and heard his pained cry, and so he moved to him, allowing him to lean against him, and hearing him say he'd lost one uncle today, and he refused to lose another. Jay telling him that Ned Stark and Jorah Whitwolf were both dead, and he'd been too slow, too far away to save them. You saved me. Jay, you saved me. Think about that, and not what you were not able to do. Think about that, and know how Ilaria and my children will feel. You are not a god, Jay, no matter what power you wield. You don't control fate, and were it me in your uncle's Ned's place and he who stood with you now, he'd tell you the same. He said as Jay moved from him. I must go. I need to go. Be safe and I'll do my best to remain the same, he said, as his nephew nodded, and then moved to Rhaenys, who looked at Jay, and then at him, his niece's purple eyes showing what he felt was relief, and was perhaps mirrored in his own. He watched them as they took off, and flew back towards the army of the dead. Oberyn spinning his spear as he too made his way back to his men. When he arrived back, he saw Jaime Lannister and Arthur both unharmed, and he thanked the gods that they still stood. His nephew had lost too much in this war already, and he feared for him should he lose any more. Riverlands 302 AC. Garen, the water wizards used the green fork to wash the dead away as they came at them, his spearmen taking care of any that the waters missed. He and Loras fought side by side, his spear and Loras's sword taking down as many of the dead as the water wizards or spearmen did. Still, they came despite the dragons, the wildfire, the red priests, and the scorpions, still they came. He believed they were lesser, that even their numbers didn't or couldn't manage the losses they had inflicted upon them. A part of him feared though that perhaps their numbers would run out before the dead did. Another part wondered why they'd not raised those who fell, why they'd not been faced with or needed to kill their own men. Was it the king? Was it his magic? Was the Night King unable to do so? Weakened somehow? The answer when it came was simple, or at least to him, it seemed simple. They'd not raised the dead because they couldn't do so from a distance. They needed to be close to them to be able to. Mayhap the Night King could do so himself. But his minions, his generals, his White Walkers, they only possessed a fraction of his power. They had what he gave them, and no more. A small piece of magic, and that was it. Paranoia, or greed, he knew not which, but the Night King was not for sharing. Loras, he shouted when he saw the White Walker raise his arms, and Loras raised his sword and the arrows flew. Some were easily dodged, but a volley was a volley, and some hit home. Garen leading the cheers when the White Walker fell and the dead nearest to it fell with him. He moved from Loras to where Nesla stood with the other water wizards. Garen quickly telling her what he'd noticed about the White Walkers and what he believed to be true, and then he told Loras to gather their men and to move from the river. Why? His love asked, and he told him the same thing he just told Nesla. The wave was large and he watched it as it swept over the bodies of the dead and those of his men who'd fallen. In time he'd see their bodies return to tread in, or should he fall then it would left to others to do so. For now, they'd find peace in the river's waters, and though it was not the Redden, he felt it would do just as well. The Green Fork led into the Trident, and that river meant much to his king. It was where Rhaegar Targaryen had fallen, and if it was good enough for Jeddy's father, then he was now honoring his men. War. Loras called out, and he looked on as the next wave of dead moved towards them, and noticed the White Walker being covered by them so their arrows could not hit home. Him, Loras. Him we need to stop, he said, pointing to the White Walker, and together with a large group of their men they moved towards it. They easily cut down the dead in front of them, and had it not been that he was so focused on the White Walker, then he may have wondered about that. Instead, he and Loras just kept moving and eventually found themselves face to face with it. It was only then he realized that they'd done as it had wished, as around them the dead made sure they could not be reached, and given where they were their archers were even less useful now. Seeing the White Walker move towards Loras, he soon realized something else. Loras was the target, and this hadn't been about raising more dead. This was about going after those that Jek cared about, trying to break his spirit by taking away those he loved. Loras, he shouted in panic as he moved towards him, his spear deflecting the blow that almost took his love's head. Together they were more than a match for the White Walker. Its speed was impressive, as was its power, but against both a spear and sword, less so. Garen tried to create an opening, and even though they had the upper hand, he prayed that Loras kept as cautious as he was. The two of them moving in and then out, and it was then he heard the pained cry from his love, and saw Loras fall to the ground. One of the dead had moved in from behind, and had thrust a knife into Loras's side, and though it was not a fatal wound, the one that came next would be. "Mother Rhine, I beseech you to come to my aid, to strike down my enemies and protect those I love," he called, and then a moment later he felt the water as it swept over their heads. The dead were washed some distance away, as was Loras. Daeron looking to his love as he rose to his feet and placed his hand on his side. In front of him, the White Walker looked confused, and seemed perplexed as to where his icy blade had gone. As for him, he carried his spear in his hand, and he moved quickly. Daeron attacking the White Walker before he could form another blade. The spear hit him and the White Walker exploded into shards of ice. The dead who'd not yet made it to their feet, now never would. As for those who had, it would be only briefly that they did so, as some began to fall and others were soon cut down by his men. "Loras," he called out, worriedly as he moved to his love, his hands moving Loras's own away, as he checked his wound and saw to his relief that while bad it was not life-threatening. "I'm well. You're unhurt?" Loras asked, and Daeron nodded as he bid him lean against him and moved across to the other side of the river where they'd set up their wounded. He heard the bird chirp loudly. It's question one that he knew, even though it never truly asked. Looking to it, he smiled and nodded, as if to say he had this, and heard the bird make a relived chirp. His king, his love's friend, and brother by choice, had nothing to fear in regards to Loras's safety. Targaryen would do all he could to ensure that Riverlands 302 AC, Jon Royce. Other than those who'd broken through their lines, he and the Knights of the Vale had little to do so far in this battle. Given the dead that had attacked their lines, their cavalry, even a heavy one, had no true part to play. Not yet, at least. He and the others watched as those on foot fought, Lord Tydos and the men of the Riverlands, the Wildings, men of Dorne, the West and the North. Behind him were more than 20,000 mounted knights, all bearing lances tipped with dragonglass, or for those lucky enough, Valyrian steel. Though they bore their steel swords and other castle-forged weapons, it would not be those they wielded should the call come. Instead, it would be maces of dragonglass, and the axes and halberds made from the same material. Dead men feared no steel other than Valyrian, and there was simply not enough of that to go around. Jon had sat and watched and see incredible things. Things he'd never have imagined he could see or never would have believed had he not. He'd not seen the dragons in action against the Knights of the Vale or the Golden Company, but as he'd watched them today, he was glad they had used restraint against one rather than the other. Even the Golden Company had not faced flames such as these, and he thanked the gods that they were on the same side. "Lord Jon, Lord Jon." He heard a voice call out and turned to see Sarah Morton Waynwood point to the riders that came his way. Men of the Reach, the West, and the one leading them was a man he now knew all too well. Ser Richard Lonmouth, the King's Master of Whisperers, had become, perhaps, the most talked-about member of Jaehaerys' small council. The man was even more feared than the Spider had been, and very much more respected. With a nod to Sarah Morton, he turned from the front of the line and rode to where the Knight of Skulls and Kisses and the men he rode with now were. "Sir Richard," he said with a respectful nod, and he looked to see Sarah Garland, Mathis Rowan, who looked as if he'd aged 10 years, Kevin Lannister and Lord Beric Dondarrion, along with Sir Lyle Craycall and Sir Adam Maribrand, amongst the group of riders who'd come his way. "It's time, Lord Jon. A double envelopment. Ride and ride hard and do not dally. To the other side, my lord, regroup, and then ride back to your place in the line. One charge is all his grace asks of you, and I beg you listen to mine and the king's words. You'll find no glory by standing and fighting. Should it come, it'll come by doing as you're bid. Our king believes it will take but one charge, and he wishes you to then be ready, should you need to be deployed again." Sarah Richard said, and Jon nodded. "The Knights of the Vale will do as his grace orders." "Sarah Richard, on that you have my vow," Jon said. "As will the men of the West," Lord Kevin said. "And we of the Reach," Ser Garland added. "And the men of the Storm," Lord Beric said loudly. "Make ready your men, and at the king's signal, ride and ride hard. May your gods go with you." Sarah Richard said, and Jon was the first man to ride back. He rode down the line and repeated the orders, his words firm as he told them that this is why they came here. This is why the Knights of the Vale had been called. "We ride for our king and for our families. We ride for the realm, and we bring the dawn," he shouted to cheers. He heard it then, the loud roar of the king's dragon, and the light that shined from his sword lit the way. Jon had no need to blow his horn. The order was received loud and clear, and as one the horses moved forward. A walk, a trot, a gallop, and finally a charge. Lances were lowered down as they rode faster still, and he felt the crash of his horse into the first of the dead in front of him. Long before he felt his lance hit home. Some men behind him fell, some horses were brought down, but the Knights of the Vale rode hard and they rode true. Sooner than he expected, they passed the men of the Reach, West and Storm. The dead they now faced were fewer. The gaps between them were larger, and after losing his lance, Jon took out his mace and began to swing it left and right. When he reached the other side and turned his horse around, he looked to see the large open space they'd cut through the dead, and then the dragon's flames, as they burned those on the other side of that space. There were gaps, large gaps, and the army that had seemed to have none now had many. Looking to the Knights of the Vale, he could see their eagerness to ride again, the desire to charge one more time. They'd lost few men in the charge, 1,000 maybe less. He'd wager. "We retreat, as per the king's orders." He shouted loudly, and there was no dissent, no angered cries, and no breaking of his ranks. Jon led his men back behind the lines, and then they formed up once more, the Knights of the Vale ready should they be called upon again. "My lord," Ser Morton said, handing him the water pouch which he drank from eagerly, and Jon smiled. Glad to have played his part, and to see so many of those with him ready to do so again, should the call come. Riverlands 302 AC, Garland. He forewent a lance, a sword was his best asset, and the one he bore was as good a one as any. Far better than most even if it had not yet been decorated or had its design added to. Its hilt was plain black leather, and its pommel was a piece of black dragon glass. There were no jewels, and other than the ripples in the steel, it didn't look special at all. Valyrian steel was Valyrian steel, though, and a gift from the king was something that was to be appreciated. In time he'd make it look as impressive as its blade demanded. For now, it was everything he needed it to be. The Apple's Bite he'd named it, having considered many other names, and discarding them. Names such as Thorn, Roselips, and Gallant. He'd always hated been named as such. But he found the idea of being able to draw his blade when someone did so to be a most amusing one. In the end, he wished to honor his wife and her house too, and so it was with Lyanette and their babe in mind that he'd named the sword. Perhaps that was a funny thing to ponder upon, as you readied to charge into an army of dead men. But it at least took your mind away from the fact you were riding into an army of dead men. He looked to the men with him, 5,000 men of the West. 3,000 men of the Storm, and almost 10,000 men of the Reach, the finest cavalrymen the realm had to offer, barring the men on the other side of the field, men they'd be riding with and not against, and that gave him even more hope that this was the right thing to do. Though truth be told, he had placed his faith in his king and had yet to see anything to threaten that faith. As he heard the roar of the dragon and saw the light shine in the distance, he gave the order and heard Lord Beric and Lord Kevin do the same. "For the king and for the dawn," he shouted loudly, as the horses began to move. The ride was soon at full pace. The lances were down, and the Apple's Bite was ready to be swung. Its first swing taking ahead and then its second crashing against a dead thing's jaw. Beneath him his horse rode well, and yet he cursed himself for not bringing one of Willis's with him. He had 3 back at Highgarden, and yet he'd left them there. Instead, he purchased a garron for the harsh lands of the north, and had found that to be a wise move. Then, here and now, he rode a borrowed destrier and wished it was his own horse instead. As he crashed his sword down on another dead thing, he saw the Knights of the Vale just ahead of him, and he looked to the dead behind them. There were fewer, much fewer, and he could see now that, while men would wish to regroup and charge once more, they'd already done sterling work here today. As he passed a Vale Knight and crashed his sword into another dead thing, he felt the horse go out from under him, and he flew through the air. Unfortunately for him, it was not on a dragon. The fall was hard, the ground even harder, and he was winded when he got up and saw the true extent of the situation. He now found himself in. Fewer the dead may be, but there were still far more of them than there was of him, and was that not enough of a problem? Then the Whiter Walker that moved his way would surely be so. He was surprised that the dead left him alone. The White Walker alone, moving to him, and its icy blade raised up in a challenge that he had no choice but to accept. All his life he'd spent practicing his swordsmanship, and very quickly he began to worry that he'd not practiced enough. The White Walker had him beat in almost every aspect, and Garland was beginning to fear it was toying with him. Though he dodged the strikes aimed at his body, he felt himself faltering, and while he was tiring, the White Walker very much was not. The sound of the bird chirping distracted him only briefly. The eagle flying at the White Walker and the icy blade that had been aimed at him now moved to take the eagle down. Moving forward quickly, Garland thrust the apple's bite and heard the sound of the ice as it shattered, and then the sound of dead men around him falling. His joy soon turned to horror when he saw the group of White Walkers that moved towards him. 2, 3, no 4, he counted, and he knew he was fucked. "Sir Garland," he heard a voice call out, and he turned to see Mathis Rowan in front of him, upon a horse, the man holding out his hand to help him up onto it. Why he placed him in front of him, he knew not, but now was not the time to question such things. So taking hold of the reins he urged the horse to ride, and ride fast. He felt it when Mathis slumped against him, and when his arms loosened their grip on his waist. Garland reaching around with one hand to make sure that he didn't fall from the horse as he rode quickly to where his men had formed up. As he reached them, Mathis fell and he stopped the horse to jump off and to see to him. Only then did he notice the ice arrow that was stuck in Mathis's back. Mathis, we'll get you help. Hold on, he said, looking at the man. The shake of Mathis's head and the look in his eyes along with the wound itself, telling him that there would be no healing for Mathis today, or any other day. I served my king. I protected his kin. May it be enough to forgive me my mistakes, and earn me a place with my gods. Mathis said as he coughed, and Garland looked at the blood that began to flow from his mouth. You're a good man and true, Mathis. I know it. His Grace knows it, and I'll ensure the realm knows it, he said, and saw the smile begin to form on Mathis's face before it, and Mathis were gone from this world. Riverlands 302 AC. Tormund. Green fire, dragon fire, a wall of light, flames that seemed to come from the woman in red and her red warriors, all had hit the dead, and yet they still kept coming. Jae, the Silver Princess, and the half-man, all took their mighty beasts and laid down more flames than he had ever seen in his life. And yet still they kept coming, even after the men on horses had ridden through them and cut them down as if they were nothing. Still they kept coming. How many his axe had ended for true was something he'd never know. He simply couldn't count that high. Nor could he count high enough to know how many of his people had fallen. Only to know it was too many, far too many. Tormund fought side to side with the Giant of Umber. Mance was a little further away from him, with the Giant's son and other men of the North and True North. Those of the Company of the Rose were mixed between his people and the North's, and far too many of those had fallen too. The Giant of Umber was a mighty man, both on and off the battlefield. He was a man he was happy to name as a friend, and one that he was more than happy to fight side by side with. Yet even they together were no match for the dead, as there were simply too many of them. Tormund felt it, the chill getting ever worse, and he saw him before the Giant did. The White Walker moving towards the man's son and Mance, and so he shouted out in warning, "Lance, Goatsbane." His voice carrying in the wind, and despite the fights the men were in, they looked to him. "Walker," he shouted, and began to swing his axe as hard and as fast as he could. The Giant of Umber doing likewise with his own once he saw who it was that the White Walker was moving to. Whether it was Mance that was its target, or the Giant's son, it mattered not. The White Walker, he knew, would cut down one to get to the other. Septon, the Giant called out his worry for his boy, plain for all to see, and Tormund then was witness to true, unadulterated rage. If he had named the man fierce before, then watching him now would name him a liar. The swings of the axe were furious, and the dead were simply swept away, as the Giant of Umber brushed them aside. Those he didn't hit with the axe were hit with a clubbing blow from his arm. Tormund quickly moving with him and trying to keep up as he watched yet another dead thing fly and land some feet away from them both. Two things soon became clear to him as they moved. The White Walker was more than a match for both Mance and Goatsbane, and neither he nor the Giant would make it to their aid in time. The Giant called out in pain, as Goatsbane fell to the ground. He'd not been hit with the sword, but had been slapped away by the White Walker. "Mance," he shouted out, as his king, his friend, now fought for his life, while the White Walker readied to pick his spot. Even despite the fact they were still fighting the dead themselves to try and reach Mance and Goatsbane, Both he and the Giant of Umber looked to each other. OWWWWW. Odo. WWWWW. He saw them, tens of them, hundreds of them. The wolf pack was the largest he'd ever seen, and they were moving far more quickly than wolves should move. Yet it was the one who led them that brought a smile to the Giant of Umber's face. The wolf that moved faster than any of them, and as Tormund felt dead men around him fall to the smaller wolves, he watched as the giant white one soared through the air and took the White Walker to the ground. Ghost. The Giant of Umber said almost reverently, and Tormund looked on as Goatsbane, who'd now risen back to his feet, moved to the White Walker and crashed his axe down on it, as the White Wolf moved away to allow him to do so. Around him, the other wolves too moved back, Tormund watching as more men came running their way, and the dead who'd been knocked to the ground soon found they'd not be rising to their feet. He heard some cheers and looked on as the dragon the half-man named his laid down its flames. A little closer to them, the warmth of them was a welcome respite from the chill in the air, and he then saw the Silver Princess's dragon, and Jade's doing the same. Not too far from their lines, he and the Giant of Umber finished off the dead nearest to them, and he saw the way the man looked to the White Wolf. Tormund finally getting a good look at the mighty beast himself. Its eyes were as red as blood, its fur as white as the purest snow. Were he to name it as anything, he'd call it a weirwood, come to life, a gift from the old gods in wolf form. The King's Wolf, the Giant of Umber said, smiling, as the wolves moved away from where they had been and followed the White One down the lines. Their work obviously not done as of yet. Around them, there were far fewer dead than before. So few that it took them time to reach them, and allowed for he and the Giant of Umber to speak to Mance and Goatsbane, as well as the man leading the reinforcements that had come to their aid. Him he liked instantly. Bronn was a man he could certainly see himself enjoying an ale with. As for Mance, he looked as if he'd seen a ghost, which given what the Giant of Umber had named the wolf as, he had. Yet it was the look on Goatsbane's face that he'd remember later, when he told this tale. A look of awe and gratitude he'd rarely seen, and he wore a smile bigger than any man he'd ever known. I always liked that wolf, Goatsbane said to a loud laugh and a slap on his back from his father. Here they come, Mance said, barely a moment later. And he, Mance the Giant of Umber, Goatsbane, and Bronn joined the line and readied to fight once again. Riverlands 302 AC. Yaoris Targaryen? As he was laying down the flames, he heard them in his head, the birds calling out that his family was in trouble, that it was more than one that did so, worried him greatly. Beneath them the dead were thinning. To look at them you'd not know that, but he did. He could feel the magic as it dissipated. The loss of it almost felt like a warm breeze on a winter's day. That it was not his loss pleased him greatly, and yet he had not time to celebrate or take comfort in that. Jade told Rhaenys to fly, to leave the battle for now, and to fly fast, and as she did so he closed his eyes. Loras and Garin fought against a White Walker. Jaime, Oberyn, and Arthur too. Cregan had taken down a White Walker, and Garin was safe on horseback, ready for his own orders. His uncle and his loyal Kingsguard. It was to Ned and Jorah that he looked, and he knew he was too late. As were Robb and Benjen. As Rhaenys flew faster, he was torn between screaming out in anger or breaking down in tears, and were it not for the fact that his family was still in danger, it may have been the latter instead of the former that he gave in to. Dready age, as loudly as he could. His fury fueling him, and Rhaenys welcomed that. It was that he channeled. It would be much needed for what was to come. His sister continually laid down her flames as she flew. They may be leaving the battle for now, but they were still a part of it. She looked into himself. He opened the doors and told the birds what he wished from them. Then he called upon another flock and bid them fly fast. The two White Walkers who'd taken his uncle from him had more of his family in their sights, and he feared that he'd not reach them in time either. In this he was proved right. He'd never have made it to Robb or Benjen, and as the White Walkers moved towards them, the birds he'd called upon arrived. Jai watched as they attacked the White Walkers, as Robb moved to pick up ice from his uncle's hands. And then as Benjen brought down one of the White Walkers, ice was swung and the birds moved away from the other White Walker. The look on Robb's face was one of pure fury, while the White Walker bore one of surprise. Only one of those looks would last a moment longer.
Reverend Jay,
he heard Rhaenys say, and he moved from the bird that he'd watched his uncle and brother through to the one nearest his uncle. Robb and Benjen were safe for now. Oberyn was anything but. Faster, Ray. Faster. In truth, he didn't need to tell her, and whether it was her own will, the gods, or if in the end, it all came down to luck. It mattered not as they arrived, not a moment too soon. It was Rhaegar and not he who chose their course of action. Jael almost laughing, and he would have if the situation was not so serious. When she picked the White Walker up in her talons and flew high before dropping him some distance away, and then landed close to him. Jumping from her back, he moved to the White Walker and sent him back to the 7 hells that he came from, before then speaking to his uncle and making sure that he was unharmed. He welcomed his uncle's arms, and the resolve his words brought back to him. Then he and Rhaegar flew back to do what they needed to do. When he saw the amount of the dead that the 3 dragons had burned away, he knew it was time. And so once again, it was to the birds he called out to. His orders had been specific, 1 charge and 1 charge only, and he believed they'd be followed. He prayed they would. As the cavalry formed up, it was to other birds he looked. To different birds, and he smiled at what he saw. Moons they'd walked for, and most still remained safe and far from the fight. Some, though, had wished to play their part, and so he'd allowed them to. The pinnacles had picked them up in Eastwatch, and though it was less than 50, they and the weapons they carried would turn the tide even further. All he had to do was give the call, and the giants would be brought to bear. Soon he thought as he looked at them as they crossed the river as if it was a mere stream. The green fork no match for 1-1 or Maggie the Mighty. The dragonglass scythes in their hands may have not been tested, but he believed they'd work, and Gendry had not let him down so far. "Denny J," he heard Rhaegar say, and he looked to see where his aunt and Elegon were, only to not find them. "Has she?" he asked worriedly as he went searching for her with other eyes, relieved to see she had not, and was well, though for some reason she flew away from rather than towards the fight. "She is doing as she must," a voice called out in his head. Jay, taking a moment to realize, it was the 3-eyed raven he was hearing. "As must you, my prince." The cavalry charge was a thing of beauty. His orders followed just as he had bid them be. Dead, rotting bodies were no match for lance, horse or man, and he felt the magic dissipate even more. After it was done, he again had Rhaegar lay down her flames, and he felt she was beginning to tire. Looking into himself, he wondered if he had another wall of light left in him, or if it was to be a different form that his magic would need to take. For now, he needed her to rest, and if Rhaegar must, then so must the other 2 dragons as well. So flying to them both, he found Tyrion first, and bid him fly back to camp. Denied it seemed, having already decided to. Just as before, they weren't idle when they flew, both Rhaegar and Rhaenyx laying down their flames on those who would seek to reinforce the Night King's army's lines. He felt ghost before he heard the howls, and was in him less than a moment later. The White Wolf was not in King's Landing by his wife's side, and it both annoyed and worried him, though he was grateful to see what he did, and the pack that he'd brought with him. "Fight pack," Ghost said, when he questioned him, and then he watched as the White Wolf went looking for those that he and Jay considered so. "He knows. Jay, he knows," Rhaenyx said, as they passed their lines and landed next to Elegon and Rhaegar. "Knows what?" he asked as he climbed down from her back. "That it's time to sing your song," his sister said happily. Were it not for what, or to be more precise who it was that he saw standing next to Dany, then he'd have questioned Rhaenyx, and even Ghost more. As it was, he moved to the thing that was his aunt, his hand hovering over Lightbringer's hilt. As he did so, Dany shook her head, the smile she wore, a true one, and he heard her. Then in his own, "I am me, nephew. Not fully me, but even more so than I was when Dany came to me," Shara said, and Jay looked more closely at her. She looked almost like a White Walker, except very much not. Her silver hair was almost fully back, and only some of it looked white. Her skin, though icy and cold to the touch, was soft and fleshy, and her eyes sparkled as much as they always had. "How?" he asked, and this time she spoke for true. "He is weak, Jay. He is weak, and now is the time." Shara replied, "I don't know where he is, Aunt. I've sought him out, but he remains hidden from me," he said frustratedly. "He seeks more magic, Jay. He's not with his army because he seeks more magic," Shara said, and she had no need to say more. "Jay," Dany called, as he ran to Rhaenyx. "I must go." "I must. We'll come with you, Jay. Both of us," Tyrion said, and Jay shook his head. "Fly when you can. Bring more flames down on the dead. This is not a fight you can take part in." He heard his words, and how resigned they were, and he shook his head. That was not how he meant them to sound. "I will beat him. I am unafraid," he said, far more determinedly. After he hugged first his aunt and then his uncle, Shira then moved forward, and it was like holding ice in his arms, the chill remaining with him even as he and Rhaenyx took to the sky. It took him no time at all to find him, and he actually laughed at his good fortune. Of all the places that he could go, of all the roads he could take, it would have to be this one. Rhaenyx laid down her flames at the dead who marched with him, yet he could feel her tiredness even more now, and so he bid her stop. "Jane?" she said angrily. "Land and fly high, Ray, and watch," he said. And reluctantly, she did as he bid. They were perhaps a few hundred feet apart from each other. Cheptas was now as close to him as he had been in Hardhome. He saw the ice spear as it formed in his hands and waited for it to be thrown towards him, catching it with Lightbringer when it was and feeling his anger and annoyance even from this far apart. When the Night King raised his hands and his wights began to run towards him, Cheptas smiled and closed his eyes. The birds called out loudly and flew leading them to him, and he knew they'd be here soon. "Now it ends," he said as he began to move away from the river and towards his fate.